Hello, all. Voting is the most basic and concrete action that we can take in American democracy. And the start of that process for many voters is the primary election, where the contours of races are decided and nominees are chosen. For that reason, how voters participate in these elections are of the utmost importance. Today, we'll discuss new insights into primary election turnout across the US, as well as structural reforms that may bring more Americans into the process. My name is Matt Brown, a Washington Post reporter on our democracy team, and I will be moderating today's panel. Our topic, what's the matter with primaries? Examining primary turnout and reforms. Joining me today are Dan Laughlin, a Pennsylvania Republican state senator, Michael Thorning, the director of structural democracy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, Jonathan Christ-Tompkins, former Democratic representative in the Alaska House of Representatives, and Ryan Williamson, a governance fellow at the R Street Institute. Michael, I'd like to start with you today to hear about the center's newest report. Can you tell me about the findings that you all found in this study?
Absolutely. And Matt, first, I want to thank you for moderating this and thank Senator Laughlin and Jonathan and Ryan for agreeing to be on the panel. We're really looking forward to it. Our latest report looks at something relatively unique, which is midterm primary turnout. And in the report, we focus on that because we think away from sort of all the pomp and pageantry of presidential elections, you get somewhat of a better sense of how much Americans really are participating in our primaries. So our midterm primary turnout report had some interesting data findings, and I'm going to show you some of that here, and we'll get started with that. So first, I want to thank my report co-author, Joshua Farrar, who's just been a wonderful person to collaborate with, and all of the eloquence and genius of this report is a reflection on him, and certainly any mistakes are more a reflection on me. But this gives you just a sense of where nationally, what national primary turnout looked like in 2022. Unfortunately, as you can see, a lot of those states really are in that lower turnout light blue range, with just a few states standing out in terms of falling into the higher turnout categories that we at the Bipartisan Policy Center would prefer to see. BPC in 2014 set some benchmarks or targets that we thought states should meet. By 2020, we thought states should be hitting 30% turnout. And by 2025, we thought they should be hitting 35% turnout. And as our report demonstrates, not many states are actually hitting these, and unfortunately, most of them are far below. Right here, the good news, though, is that overall primary turnout nationally is up, and that has been a continuing trend in the last few cycles. And even exceeding what people thought were pretty high turnout rates in 2010 and 2018 midterms. Here, this gives you a sense of how states performed, in a variety of different categories. So, we've got our top 5 and bottom 5 states here. Kansas led the nation with 48% turnout, perhaps not surprising given the really high-profile ballot measure on abortion rights. But then it was followed by Wyoming, which might surprise some people, but Wyoming actually is a state with pretty consistently high turnout, but this even was above where they normally are. And we think that probably has a lot to do with the House seat Republican primary for their at-large House seat between former Representative Liz Cheney and now Representative Harriet Hageman. Alaska, where Jonathan is from and knows those politics well, had probably just the utmost interesting election you could imagine. Not only was the state experimenting with its new top 4 or final 4 system, but amidst the primary, there was also a special election for a vacant House seat, and there were competitive Republican primaries, or there were a number of competitive Republican candidates vying in both the House and Senate primary. And then, we are rounded out by Washington and Oregon. Unfortunately, in the bottom states, we see some that are particularly interesting for this report, but I'll note Virginia and New York and Mississippi, and we will come back to some of that a little bit later on here. But we've had some of these states, not surprisingly, gained a lot. And I want to point out Pennsylvania was a state that had a very competitive Republican Senate primary, a competitive Democratic Senate primary, and a very competitive Republican gubernatorial primary. And so perhaps it's not surprising that they had a double-digit percentage point gain there. And of course, we saw, battleground states in Georgia. We saw, as I already discussed, Wyoming, Alaska, and Kansas. Some of the states that dropped, we think that has to do with just changing dynamics around what was actually up in those states in 2022. Some states did not have a Senate contest, for instance. And so, we think that has an impact. But, we're here to talk kind of about primary systems and how that might impact turnout in states. And so, taking a look at, a variety of the different formats that we found there was more turnout in the more open primary systems, and probably very expectedly there was lower turnout in the closed primary systems because there's a number of voters who simply can't participate in those. And so you see closed primaries on average below 20% turnout, whereas just open primaries on average are able to exceed that by a few percentage points. And then systems like top 2 and top 4 saw a much higher turnout in 2022. Those are systems that involve nonpartisan primaries where all the candidates participate in one primary and 2 or 4, depending on the system, advance to the general election. Interestingly, we did find evidence that states that switched from a closed primary system to an open primary system were able to boost their turnout just by doing that by about 2 percentage points. And states that switched to a top 2 or top 4 system actually boosted their turnout by about 3 percentage points, which is a 16% increase. So I think that speaks to the way these systems certainly contribute to voters being more able to influence the candidates that they'll see in November. But beyond the format of the primary, we also looked at some of the other factors and decisions that states make and wanted to investigate how those impact primary turnout. And so, we found that states that do not align their federal and state primaries really have low turnout. And I want to draw your attention back to 3 states I mentioned who were in the bottom 5: Mississippi, Virginia, and New York. So these states have off-year elections for state and local office. For instance, in Virginia, there were not statewide contests because they didn't have a Senate primary this year, and so their turnout was fairly low. New York is a state that had planned to switch from this system and align their federal and state primaries. Unfortunately, they did not go through with that because of delays in their redistricting process. And so we're expecting that in the next iteration of this report in 4 years, we imagine we'll see New York closer to the kinds of turnout we see when states align their federal and state primaries. Another issue we looked at was, the number of primary dates across the country. We found that states hold their primaries on 19 different dates, and that can be fairly confusing for voters. And it certainly does not build media momentum and attention unless there are high-profile contests or contests that people think might make the difference on the national stage in terms of House and Senate control of those chambers. And so you see there's a lot of variation here. And what we found is actually that when states hold their primary closer to a regional neighbor or neighboring state that they actually do boost their turnout. And part of the reason we looked at this is that the Bipartisan Policy Center, since about 2014, has been advocating for a national congressional primary date. And we think this is evidence that when there is much more cohesion, among the dates, that voters are more aware and more likely to participate. And so just some final conclusions here about the reforms that BPC encourages states to adopt. We encourage them to adopt primaries that are open to all eligible voters, should hold elections on a single national primary date, or at least on regionally aligned dates. And we want to see states combine their primaries for state office with their primaries for federal office.
Thank you for that overview, Michael. Much appreciated. I'd like to turn now to our other panelists. Senator Laughlin, can you talk for a moment about your proposal to open up primaries last year and what that would mean for voters in your state and others? Why do you believe that bringing in non-affiliated voters into party primaries is the best way to expand this process?
Well, absolutely, Matt. And I appreciate you folks having me on today to talk about my bill that would open up Pennsylvania's primaries. I've watched the last few election cycles. For those that may not have been paying close attention, I represent Erie County, and Erie County has been a national focus in both the 2016 and 2020 presidential election cycles. We're like just kind of a microcosm of the whole country here. And it's kind of fun to represent a district like this. And the other thing that sometimes people don't really think about when we talk about the unaffiliated or independent voters is most of those folks either were Republicans or Democrats, or they might be new voters that just maybe not have picked a team, so to speak, because they're young and they have open minds and they want to participate in our democracy, but they don't necessarily want to be a member of a specific party. I think it's very important to engage these folks in the primary system, because if you don't, they don't really have any skin in the game in the fall then either. And I think it's vitally important to engage these voters. It's a very fast, rapidly growing demographic within Pennsylvania for sure. And I think nationwide, there's a lot of folks that aren't happy with our party system and don't necessarily want to wear that label. So I think it's very important to get these voters involved in our primary system.
Right. It's an interesting reform process, but definitely not the only one that we've seen analyzed in this report or all across the country. So I'd love to turn to Jonathan really fast as well to hear his perspective on Alaska's elections. Specifically, Jonathan, could you tell us a little bit about what the process was like to actually reform this system? What were the biggest hurdles that you all found in it? And what were some potentially unexpected or surprising things that you also all encountered? Not sure we can hear you yet. All right, well, while we fix Jonathan's audio, I will turn back to Michael. Michael, could you just talk for a little bit about, given the research that we all know from 2014 now, and that you all have now done this new review, what in your view are the most impactful policies overall in terms of increasing turnout in these elections? What if the audience had any one single takeaway is the factor that most allows people to participate in this process, or the change that would most allow people to participate in this process in any state?
I think in general, it's probably the top one that we pointed to, which is opening primaries up to all voters. As we've been talking about, that can come in a number of different forms. That could be simply a more open primary system where independents are allowed to choose which primary they're going to participate in. That could be something more like a nonpartisan primary with a top 2 or top 4, like Alaska and California and Washington have. And so, we don't try to distinguish between them necessarily, but as I said earlier, our evidence certainly is that systems like top 2 and top 4 have a greater boost than just simply switching to an open primary. But I think to put some real example to this, to Senator Laughlin's point, there have been some really crucial elections recently in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Republican Senate primary, between a number of candidates, including Mehmet Oz, and the Democratic Senate primary with John Fetterman and Connor Lamb, and then you had a very competitive Republican governor primary in Pennsylvania. There are about 1 million independent voters who in the state who couldn't weigh in on which of those candidates they would prefer come the general election in November. And so potentially that's impacting actually the competitiveness of those races. There's very good evidence, and Senator Laughlin is absolutely right that we know that many independent voters have predictable, consistent patterns when it comes to voting for one party or the other. And so leaving that input out may result in a candidate that doesn't match up as much with your voters who are independents. It may not be the candidates that they want, and they may not be excited to turn out and come vote in November, or they may choose to vote with the other party. And so I think a system that allows more of those voters to participate is going to be a better signal for the parties when it comes to who their general election candidates should be.
Definitely. Absolutely. I think we can turn back to Jonathan now to hear maybe his perspective on what it was like actually implementing a new system.
Okay, great. I'm so sorry about that. So Alaska was a ballot initiative state, and the implementation process was very, I guess you could say, grassroots, and we were sort of out of the legislative arena. I mean, not to say that a lot of legislators weren't involved, and then on implementation, there's been a lot of legislative interest in terms of possibly revisiting the system that we adopted, but it was qualified for the 2020 ballot in Alaska. I've been involved in a couple of ballot initiatives over the last decade, and at least in Alaska, the signature threshold is relatively aggressive. So you really have to have both a statewide effort to collect signatures from all parts of the state, and then the threshold is sufficiently meaningful that you really have to invest resources and time and volunteer capacity to get the necessary signatures to qualify for the ballot. So by the time it got on the 2020 ballot, there was already a tremendous amount invested. The initiative was coupled with some campaign finance reforms as well. So it was sort of a two-in-one commingled package deal of an initiative. And it just barely passed 5149 in Alaska. It might have even been like 50.5 to 49.5 as a total nail biter. It was actually down on election night, and only as absentee ballots trickled in did the final tally sort of reverse itself in the positive direction. But in 2022, as much of the nation bore witness, we had our first Final Four RCV election. And just on the Final Four piece, to unpack that a little bit, because it's not necessarily an intuitive phrase or concept, that's an open primary system. So that's, California or Washington style top 2, but instead of top 2, it's top 4. So everybody is on the same ballot. And in addition, in terms of voters, to Senator Laughlin's legislation in Pennsylvania, everybody, obviously, regardless of party affiliation, can vote that ballot, which was a radical departure from what Alaska was doing previously. We previously had closed party primaries. On the Republican side, you had to be, if you were a registered Democrat, you couldn't vote in the Republican primary, or if you were a registered Libertarian, for that matter, you couldn't vote in the Republican primary. So it opened up the primary process tremendously. I would say it's probably the biggest shift in our political and electoral process since statehood. I was a supporter of the initiative, perhaps unsurprisingly, given my presence here. But I had sort of modest and incremental hopes for what it would do in terms of electoral outcomes in the state. Those modest and incremental hopes were like wildly upended in terms of the results. I thought it was just like almost as close to like a panacea in terms of promoting moderation, stymieing extremism, really on both sides of the aisle. But what you saw in reliably blue and red districts is the more moderate candidate, really about like 80+% of the time, was winning the election. And I think that's really directly attributable to the systemic change that this initiative instituted. So it's like incredibly exciting, and I'm really sort of hopeful that other states, perhaps Nevada in 2024, may follow Alaska's lead.
Definitely. I have a couple more questions on partisan politics and how they interplay into the system. But first, I want to remind attendees that if you're following along with us on the live stream or Twitter or YouTube, then you are able to submit questions to us actually by using the hashtag BPC Live. So if you have a question for any of our panelists, feel free to ask through those channels. I'd love to turn to Ryan right now and hear some of your perspective on exactly how partisanship in politics do actually impact some of this. So obviously, we've seen over the past couple of years, as Michael so skillfully pointed out, that we have seen an increase in primary turnout. At the same time, though, that there has been a heightened increase in polarization in the country and discussion of just the state of the two-party system. I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective on if we can disaggregate at all by system how party politics and partisanship might affect turnout. Is it just competitive races that turn people out more, or the national climate? What more can we understand from the other factors that are affecting these systems once they're put in place?
Right. Thank you so much for the question. Thank you, Michael, for putting this together, and the other panelists for joining. I really do think it comes down in large part to competition. Michael alluded to the Wyoming race, which I think was really emblematic. That's not necessarily a question of whether or not a Republican or Democrat would win that seat, but a fierce battle over which kind of Republican would represent the state in that seat. And importantly, it's not even necessarily about competition writ large, but even the perception of competition. Voters want to feel like their ballot matters. And if they feel like the deck is somehow stacked in a way that there's a predetermined outcome, there's very little incentive to participate. And I think that's the connotation that some of these closed primaries have, is essentially it's a foregone conclusion. Thinking about the most recent redistricting cycle, there weren't very many competitive districts. The primaries essentially became coronations, and that's not what they're supposed to be. They're simply supposed to winnow down. They're supposed to winnow down the number of candidates, and so a primary system which makes people feel like their participation is more meaningful can be more impactful now. Again, thinking about Alaska's innovation, if you only have one person on the ballot, obviously people aren't going to show up for that. But anything that leads candidates to feel like they have a chance and leads voters to feel like they have a meaningful choice, that should kind of garner greater participation.
Right, absolutely. I'd love to hear from Senator Laughlin again on what it is looking like in his state in terms of actually engaging with this primary system, both as it is, but also as it could be. I mean, as we discussed with Alaska, potentially reforms can create more moderate candidates or more moderate outcomes in this case. Would your anticipation be that would be the case in Pennsylvania as well if the system were put in?
Matt, that's an excellent point. There's two components to this bill, at least in my opinion. One is just overall voter engagement to give these unaffiliated voters the chance to vote in the primary. But I think the equally compelling reason to pass this bill is that it would moderate our candidates that head into the fall. I'm not going to sit here and name names, but we've seen some candidates obviously that can win a primary, but they have no shot at winning in November. And that happens on both sides of the aisle sometimes. And then just on a smaller scale, I'll give you an example, for the city of Erie, right? We have city council races coming up here, where basically, unless you're a registered Democrat, you're going to have no say in who winds up in the fall ballot. It's all completely 100% over in the primary. And that's not fair to our independents that live in the city, or the Republicans for that matter. I think for the Republicans that live in the city of Erie, if they could vote in the primary and actually have a say in who some of these folks are, perhaps they'd even register as an unaffiliated just to be able to vote in the primary, because a lot of them don't want to register as a Democrat, or and vice versa. I understand that, but moderation of the fall candidates, I think, is a big component of this, and it's very important. I think it gets overlooked sometimes when we talk about this.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear from each of you at the moment now about voter education. So obviously, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now would be very big changes for a lot of people in different states if it was implemented. So I'd love to hear from both a research perspective, but then also a practical policy perspective as elected officials. What do you all have experienced, or what do you all believe are the biggest challenges to actually educating voters about these potential changes, and why they would be a benefit to them? Starting with Michael.
I'm happy to jump in and say, there have often been robust voter education campaigns that accompany, states and localities switches to these kinds of systems. And I'm sure Jonathan could speak exactly to how that went in Alaska. But that has been a very common component of this, and I think a necessary component, especially as the systems diverge more and more from what voters are used to. A switch to an open primary system from a closed primary is probably going to require a bit less voter education than switching to something like top 2 or top 4, or not really the subject of what we're talking about here, but even states that are not necessarily the subject, states who have adopted ranked choice voting systems, which can be a component of top 4 and top 5, they have engaged in really robust voter education. I think about the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, when they adopted ranked choice voting. There was a campaign, there were ads on city buses, and there were stories written about it in local paper. There were ads in broadcast formats. So that is definitely something that has to happen. I think we know that voter trust in elections at the moment is a bit down, and that there have been concerns certainly raised about the legitimacy of our system and how well our system is working. And given that environment that we're in, I think it's important that states probably go above and beyond as they look to make these changes.
Absolutely. Anybody else have comments on that particular?
Well, Matt, maybe not so much on that, but just one of the things that we see in Pennsylvania that has been problematic, at least in our primaries, typically in a presidential year, is our primary is typically held, more towards the end of the primary season, and sometimes there's a fair amount of apathy heading into a primary when you already know who's going to be at the top of the ticket. And it's not related to my bill, but Pennsylvania, we are having some conversations around moving our primary sooner in that season. So just kind of putting that out there for everybody.
Matt, I would jump in, if I might, on the education and implementation side of things. I mean, in Alaska with initiative passing, that was like very much just the start of the process. I think our sort of mission and vision was totally the opposite of New York City in terms of like the ranked choice voting part. I mean, so there's both primary reform in Alaska, but also general election reform, as I think I sort of briefly touched on, and ranked choice voting, as well as the Final Four open primary. I mean, both of those were big departures from the previous status quo. And our goal was to avoid being a smoldering dumpster fire like New York City mayoral primary and their ranked choice voting election. And as a result, there was a lot of philanthropic money that was appropriated to voter education. The Alaska Division of Elections played, I think, a really strong role, like a mailer to every household in Alaska, just kind of explaining the system. There are a lot of sort of simulated elections just to sort of socialize and familiarize the system with everyday Alaskans. And then, legislators played a role in terms of talking with their constituents. There were hearings to sort of in an educational, informational context. And all of that, I think, were sort of necessary components and inputs towards the outcome, I think, by most objective measures, being really successful. There are very, few and far between reports of voter confusion. And I think it's just like really important to think about reform for primary elections or elections in general as being very much a multi-phase process, and just passing or institutional reform is only the start of the process, and there really has to be that follow-up over the sort of subsequent 2 or more years.
And if I could just put a brief button on that to kind of echo some of those points, I feel like the value of voter education cannot be overstated. It's incredibly important, especially in a time when election laws are changing, basically every 2 years, it feels like. And if voters aren't kind of aware of their ability to vote and under what circumstances and what they have to do in order to do so, that can lead to a lot of confusion and frustration as well as misinformation. And so I think that's going to be a huge obstacle, but important one to overcome when thinking about primary reform.
All right, absolutely. I would love to, again, get everyone's a quick round of response to everyone from this, starting with, I guess, Senator Laughlin. I understand that there are also out there wide criticisms from strong partisans on both the left and the right about potential primary reform, claiming that efforts like this in all of the manifold ways that we've discussed weaken parties or weaken the integrity of parties or social movements within those parties. What do you say to that? And what would be your response to any Americans who are very passionate about participating in the system, but might not necessarily see party politics as the ideal vehicle at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. First off, there's no data to support that having an open primary weakens either of the 2 main parties' structure. It just doesn't occur. One of the questions that I get asked fairly often about this bill, and not necessarily in a I don't know, partisan way that these folks ask it, but they want to know what would prevent someone from going in and voting for, let's say a bad candidate for the Republican or the Democrat to kind of sway the election. And I kindly walk them through how hard it is to even get anybody to listen and pay attention as it is now. To actually have a swayable number of voters go in, vote for, a quote unquote bad candidate on one side or the other is pretty silly. Because quite frankly, if you're worried about, the other side having a good candidate, that's who you're going to need to go in and vote for. So I don't see that happening really at all in any kind of realistic way.
Right, absolutely. Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts on just how these reforms do affect the partisanship potentially of situations or participation on that front.
Yeah, in terms of the parties, this just kind of gets back to a longstanding question that we've been working through in our political system, which is what is the role of the parties? How much should we turn those functions over to the voters? And we have been shifting since the 20th century away from sort of the idea that party leaders in smoke-filled rooms pick the candidates, although there certainly are scholars who believe that that is a better protection for more extreme candidates. But, we have moved beyond that. And actually, the United States, more than most other countries, has turned our primary process over to voters. And it's hard to see how we would step back from that. So it may be the case that the ship has sailed on the parties being the kingmaker at the end of the day. But, there are also good reasons to think that, there's other factors at play, whether it's campaign finance laws, other things that are what's really at the heart of weakening our state parties. But, I think so long as we have chosen to go down this more democratic, path where voters are the ones who are doing the winnowing of the candidates, then I think we owe it to them to adopt the best systems that we can. And I don't know that there's evidence that closed primary states have stronger state parties, which is sort of probably the way you could, most distilled turn over that power only to the party members through the vote. So, I think the participation is important, and getting more voters in there, particularly independent voters who may be voting for your party come the fall, I think would really be to those parties' benefit.
All right, absolutely. I think that now we can turn to one question from the audience, from Jim Reister. He asks from a question first for you, Senator Laughlin. Most Americans feel that the federal and state elected officials are bought off by lobbyists. How will your ideas change that? Also, many states made it harder for ballot issues, just plain old voting. Why?
Well, I can assure the gentleman that asked the question, I understand kind of the feeling out there from your average citizen that, their elected officials might be bought off. I can assure you that that's not the case. Everybody takes campaign donations from varying groups and individuals and whatnot. It's part of the process. But I personally haven't seen anything at least in the Pennsylvania Senate, where somebody was able to buy a vote. The lobbyists that interact with us on an almost daily basis, it's usually just a trade group that has hired a lobbyist to get their issues in front of you, and you sit down and you can listen to them. But obviously I can't speak for every legislator in the entire United States, but I have not seen a single example of that. And Matt, what was the second part of that question?
Many states have made it harder for ballot issues and just plain old voting. Why do you believe that is?
I can only speak to Pennsylvania. Over the last couple of years, we had a Republican majority in both the House and Senate. We had a Democratic governor. We tended to butt heads a little bit, as you might expect. So we actually had a few constitutional amendments that we were able to put on the ballot, so the voters had final say instead of just the governor's veto. So, I think the process is working.
All right, absolutely. Another question for the senator. You're quite popular today. As you know, this is from David Thornburg. As you know, I'm a strong supporter as chair of BA Ballot Pennsylvania. What is the political coalition necessary to get this done in 2023 in Pennsylvania?
Well, David, thanks for the question. You might be interested to know that I actually had a conversation with our Senate Pro Tem just this morning about my bill. And Senator Kim Ward seems supportive of it. That's going to be very helpful in trying to get this across the finish line. And I think that, as more and more of our legislators hear from their constituents that they're that would like this initiative passed, whether it's my version or the House version, it doesn't really matter to me. That, you know, phone calls and emails actually do work. Us legislators do tend to listen to our constituents.
All right, absolutely. Pivoting back to, I've got a couple more questions for some of our panelists at the moment. Pivoting back to Ryan right now. I'd love to start off with you on just hearing any perspective that you have on the types of candidates who are brought into different systems of primaries. Do we know if there's a difference between the types of people who are interested in running or who maybe for campaign finance reasons or others are able to run because of the type of system that a state has?
Yeah, so in a closed system, obviously, like I said, there's a lot necessarily maybe less opportunity to attract votes. Thinking about, you know, millions of independent voters who, you know, as a brief aside, their taxpayer dollars are still going to the conduct of these primaries that they can't participate in. And so they become kind of divorced from the process, you know, maybe don't even feel invested in the candidate who ultimately participates in the general. But if you open up the process, you provide an opportunity for candidates who might be able to effectively challenge an incumbent or effectively run in you know, maybe a more moderate position in the opposite party that's in the minority within that district. And so, you know, and that's just thinking about open versus closed. If you think about the Alaska innovation or what Nevada is considering, you don't have to win a primary to be a viable candidate. You just have to make the general election by finishing third or fourth, you know, fifth if the Nevada ballot initiative passes again. And so that is an opportunity that provides a lot more opportunity for kind of a more diverse pool of candidates, you know, with a different set of experiences, maybe more nuanced ideas, you know, more willingness to cooperate and things like so. There's plenty of reason to believe that the kind of more open the process you get, the kind of richer choice you have at the ballot if you're the voter.
It's really interesting, very, very interesting. Michael, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the same topic. Just what do we know about the relationship between the type of primary a state has and candidate quality?
You know, there's a number of factors that go into candidate quality, and you're certainly right that campaign finance is a part of it. I think we know that people who are considering running for office often have to think about whether they have the personal financial means to do it, aside from the need to raise money, whether they are parents raising children, will their job even allow for that to happen? So there's a number of factors that go into it. One at a very basic level of whether anyone encourages them to run, which I think often is missed by people, is that many people who run for office do it because they've been told by a number of people that they think they'd be good leaders in their community. So, you know, the primary, I think, allows for, you know, the shaping, you know, depending on the system of primary, you know, of what kinds of candidates will emerge. But I don't know that the primary system itself necessarily impacts who runs. I think there's a fair amount of research that shows, for instance, that, you know, a more open primary does not necessarily change the type of candidates who ultimately participate. You know, there are reasons to think that depending on a state's politics, adopting a system like this is not necessarily going to encourage, you know, different candidates to run in these elections. I think if you had a very Republican state, for instance, adopt, you know, a Final Four or Final Five system, I don't know that that's going to mean that Democratic candidates suddenly are able to, you know, advance out of the primary and then, you know, ultimately, you know, win in November. And that's not the point of these reforms very often. So, you know, I think at the end of the day, as Ryan started with, you know, the highest interest in my view is in competition and in turnout among the voters. And so, you know, I think boiling it down to the candidates themselves who might participate doesn't really get at the right motivation necessarily for adopting the reforms.
All right, definitely. On that point, so shifting gears actually, Representative Price Tompkins, could you talk to me for a moment about what it is like to really garner the political will in a state to be doing some of these reforms? I'm interested in, when you all were interested in actually convincing voters to adopt this system, what that process was like and what that campaign was like. And if you had any insights for other campaigns or legislators around the country who are interested in implementing such a system.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I was sort of in a, I don't know, conflicted position, I guess, in that I was both chairing the committee that oversaw elections in Alaska, and then I was trying to sort of be a, use that platform in the committee as sort of a forum for both sides to sort of express their position on the initiative and not, unduly tilt the scales in those hearings. I was peripherally involved in the campaign, the initiative campaign, but not as much as others. So, I mean, just with that qualification, I mean, I think this kind of graphs onto a couple of the previous questions you posed, Matt. One of which is sort of how parties think about these kinds of reforms. In Alaska, the Alaska Republican Party was wholly opposed to the initiative, and I remember holding a hearing where both supporters and opponents of the initiative were sharing their views on the initiative before the election, and the chair of the Alaska Republican Party was practically breathing fire and sort of would have, I think, incinerated the initiative language if he had that ability. And the Democratic Party was split. The party was officially neutral, but there was certainly a faction within the Democratic Party that was opposed and skeptical and sort of saw this as, I think, to a previous question, weakening their power as a party. I mean, I think ultimately the argument that sort of carried the day with Alaskans is that a closed party primary system ultimately is sort of oppositional to having maximum competition, and that there should sort of be a marketplace of ideas, a marketplace of candidates, if you will, and the most sort of pure and free expression of that competition is the best possible system. And Alaskans being a little bit libertarian, a little bit independently minded, those were arguments that I think ultimately had a lot of appeal. It's also worth noting, as I briefly mentioned earlier, there were campaign finance reforms that were bundled into this initiative that I think also had a lot of popular appeal. So that kind of served as a buoy that added some additional electoral flotation to the initiative that I think arguably may have been the difference maker. I think it's just worth noting that in Nevada, as some listening to this may know, Nevada considered a Final Five RCV initiative in 2022, and because of this constitutional amendment, it has to go up twice before voters, so it'll be up again in 2024. And my understanding from talking with people involved in Nevada is that the Nevada Democratic Party, so the exact sort of opposite of what was the case in Alaska, is wholly and entirely opposed to this initiative. And I think the sort of, at least superficial analysis, so I think it might be fair and accurate, is basically the party that is in power in Nevada, they control the legislature. Up until this last election cycle, they controlled every statewide office in the state. The Nevada Democratic Party is like, well, we run things. Why would we ever want to change a system, a status quo that is like winning us power? And I think the Alaska Republican Party had a similar perspective. But I think when you're going directly to voters, you can make sort of a greater good or bigger picture argument that ultimately can be persuasive. And as many may know, that initiative or the constitutional amendment in Nevada passed, I think it was 53-47 in 2022, and we'll see what happens in 2024.
Right, definitely. I'm segueing to that just a little bit. I'd love to hear Michael's perspective on what I thought was a really, really interesting part of this study, which is, as you said earlier, that the analysis concluded that states that hold their primaries at the same time as neighboring states increased turnout by almost 2 percentage points. I'd be interested to hear how you believe that affects, potentially building on changing these systems, and more so just teasing out like why that's potentially the case.
Yeah, I think it likely comes down to a number of factors where voter attention is more focused. There probably is momentum built up in media markets, especially for states that have shared media markets, which is not uncommon. But it gives voters just much more awareness of what's happening. When we think about the general election, everyone knows that some early Tuesday in November, they're going to be voting. When it comes to primaries now, most voters probably have no idea when their state's primary is. I think about, for myself, I don't know that on the spot I could tell you when my primaries are going to be, even exactly what month. And so I think having a more expected date, something for people to organize around, could have an effect, kind of like the Super Tuesday during the presidential primary. It really does voters a service to have either a single national day or perhaps regional primaries that will be much more memorable and recognizable to them about when they are supposed to turn out. As I pointed out earlier, I think we had 19 different days people voted on, starting in March and ending in September for primaries. It's a pretty wide range of the year for people to have to remember exactly when it's their turn in their state, especially when we're at a time that we know that there is a lot of nationalized media coverage. State and local media coverage is somewhat reduced. The coverage at that national level actually might do a lot for getting people to participate in these races.
Definitely. I'd love to hear very, very quickly from each of you. We've talked a lot about primaries here, the structure of them, how we can change them potentially to include more people in the process. But even though we can laudably praise Kansas, for instance, in 2022 for having a 48% turnout rate in their primary system, that's still less than half of the population, eligible population of the state. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what is one non-primary structural factor that you think could also help to boost turnout here and increase civic engagement? Something that maybe it isn't something necessarily directly related to primaries, but is a policy that can be passed, or something that's a bit more intangible into our social fabric that maybe we need to improve upon as a state or a country. I'd love to start with Senator Laughlin.
Well, sure, Matt. It's always a challenge trying to get people involved in the primary. I think, when you look at the turnout numbers, we're roughly averaging 22% across the country, maybe a little bit higher if there's, a real reason to turn out. And even in the general elections, 50, 60%, somewhere in that range is pretty typical. And, I've heard it described this way. A lot of voters, when they head in to vote, it's like a test that they didn't study for. And I think engaging voters is going to have to be a little bit more of a year-long process than it is just, in those couple of weeks or 3 weeks before an election when your mailbox is stuffed with mailers and your TV is full of ads. I think the entire process of involving these voters needs to be more of an ongoing thing if you want them to actually be engaged. Social media, I think has actually divided us a lot more than has helped bring people together for whatever reason. And you're not going to change that. But I think some of these initiatives like we're working on here with trying to open our primaries up, hopefully will bring people back together and get them more engaged, but it's not going to be easy. Trying to engage voters is not, it's not easy. And I think everybody on this panel knows that. So I really don't have the answer to that, Matt.
Representative Bryce Tompkins, we'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Yeah, speaking of tests you didn't study for, what a great pop quiz question. I was sort of reflecting on like other structural systemic reforms that would drive engagement. I feel like all the recommendations the Bipartisan Policy Center has put forward really resonate with me as certainly if I had a magic wand in Alaska, would love to see some of those adopted. And I feel like those are like good pro-democracy, bipartisan, no asymmetric advantage kinds of reforms. There's maybe more sort of like even more wish listy kinds of ideas. I'm compelled by the notion of, a holiday for election day, or sort of centering it sort of socially and sort of like in our civic fabric in a way that it's not quite right now. I think part of the reason that that's not realistic or happening is as the report highlights, you've got primary election days that are just scattered across the calendar. So it just feels super discombobulated, and it's harder to, build media momentum, as was mentioned earlier, and sort of help like get the national attention span focused on primary elections. And then I think some of these structural reforms where you have primary elections that really are competitive, that every voter is fully enfranchised. And I think open primary systems do that is really integral. I mean, at least in Alaska, anecdotally, there was a lot more sort of engagement and sense that people's votes had way more mileage than they may have before, and I think that's super positive in terms of greater engagement.
All right, absolutely. I'd love to hear potentially from very quick thoughts if you have them from Michael and Ryan, but
I'll defer to Ryan.
Starting with.
All right. Yeah, I would just largely echo what the senator said. Engaging voters is really hard. There is a right to divorce yourself from the process in American politics, and some people have kind of taken that because they're kind of burnt out. They're fed up with the fighting, with the polarization, feeling like they don't actually get anything out of the process. And so it is the onus of the parties and candidates to reel in voters and say, like, here is affirmatively why you should show up and support me. Here's something tangible that you can obtain from giving me some support.
All right, definitely. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Michael, please.
Yeah, no, I have just a few ideas, just to build off of that. I think one, the senator is 100% right. So much of this is voter engagement. And I do think we have typically ongoing, maybe existential crises within both parties about which voters they should be trying to reach out to, connect with, and try to bring over to their side. There's always this debate often in campaigns about, are we trying to turn out the base, or are we trying to do persuasion and to try to convince people who maybe aren't affiliated with our party to support our candidates? So I think there's not enough broad outreach, as the senator said. I think, there also is definitely a number, there is a suite of reforms that could be enacted on the election administration side that present some barriers. For instance, the Bipartisan Policy Center, picking up the Bipartisan Presidential Commission on Election Administration, their recommendations about a more automated voter registration system, particularly through state and local government agencies. We've never really fulfilled the motor voter law promise. And so I think there are a lot of states who still have improvement to do on registering people to vote when they interact with a government agency. Things that, we have not necessarily endorsed, but I think are out there and could be experimented with are around pre-registering, 16 and 17-year-olds, making efforts just to ensure that young voters have a smooth transition into the voting process. I know a number of states are experimenting with that. Outside of election administration, I think I would say, has to do with the lesson from this report. You mentioned, are there cultural aspects that, we need to weave better into the fabric of our democracy? I think the biggest one is the takeaway from this report, which is that most voters aren't showing up for the consequential election that they could participate in. We have a lot of safe seats in Congress and state legislatures due to various factors, whether it's some geographic sorting that's taken place, whether it's redistricting and gerrymandering. We have a high number of safe seats, which means that the person who wins the primary ultimately is a foregone winner for the election in November. And I think if more voters understood that, they would understand that their voting power could go a lot farther if they vote in the primary.
All right, absolutely. Well, Senator Laughlin, Michael Thorning, Ryan Williamson, and former Representative Price Tompkins, I appreciate you guys so much for having this conversation. I am left at the end of this feeling that there are, whatever challenges our country is facing, there are a plethora of policy ideas and policy solutions and people on the ground all across the country who can actually be used to implement them. So I'm looking forward to seeing these conversations continue, not just in Alaska and Pennsylvania and DC, but all across the country. And I thank everyone who tuned in to join us for this conversation, and hope that everyone learned something, because I certainly did.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep, thanks for having us on.
Thanks.